Hi everyone, it's Matt here, just welcoming you to another episode of our podcast where we speak to fellow travelers about some of the big questions, challenges, ideas, issues that are involved in this work. And we just hope that it will provide some inspiration, some insight, some thought as we go forwards. Today's interview is with Rob Hopkins, and I start by asking Rob to introduce himself. I hope you enjoy.
How would I introduce myself? I am an author and an artist and an activist and a time traveler and a father, and I live in southwest England. I'm one of the people who founded the transition movement 20 years ago, so I've been very involved with that for like 16 years or something. And then more recently, I wrote a book called From What Is to What If, and then more recently a book called How to Fall in Love with the Future. And I've been really exploring questions around futures and how we talk about them and how we think about them, and the importance of the imagination. And what's forefront in my mind at the moment, I guess, is there's one of the people who really inspired the transition movement early on, and who was a great kind of mentor and inspiration for me, a guy called Richard Heinberg, who wrote a lot about limits to growth and energy issues, passed away last week. And I was just writing a kind of memorial piece for him, and really thinking, as we kind of look at fires and awful floods in China, and these fires across Europe and across the US and different parts of the world, parts of Africa, and thinking how different the world would be looking if we'd actually listened to him. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely something where the people, those of us who've been in this work for a long time, really take no delight whatsoever in saying I told you so. And when people like him, who did that work that he did with such sort of patience and generosity and basic fundamental love of human beings and who we are, but were so kind of routinely ignored, it's that's what's kind of sitting with me a little bit at the moment.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Rob. And I think picking up the thread that you've already left us about imagination, which is where your work certainly feels like it's centered at the moment, one of the areas it's centered at the moment, I wanted to start by asking you, what do you mean by imagination, and why does it feel so important?
So my favorite definition of the word imagination comes from John Dewey, who was like an educationalist guy, and he described it as the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. And I guess for me, the reason why I focus on that is because my interest, I guess, in it started when there was about a 2-month period when I read articles by Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Amitav Ghosh, and a couple of other people, and George Monbiot, and they all said this sentence. They said, climate change is a failure of the imagination. And I was kind of left thinking, is it? What? Like what? How, I was like the kid at the back of the class going, oh, so what did you mean by that? But they'd moved on, and they were then talking about something else. And I was left sort of thinking, could it be that at a time when we're faced with an existential polycrisis that fundamentally demands that we reimagine everything, because our survival depends upon our capacity to reimagine everything, could it be that actually that human superpower, that's really what defines human beings as being distinct from all other species, is our ability to go, yeah, what if? And I wonder what's on the other side of that mountain, and to tell stories about what could be on the other side of that mountain, that actually that might be in decline. And then I read this piece of research by Kyung-Hee Kim, who was a researcher in the US, who said that looked at this thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking, which is kind of one of the closest proxies we have for a kind of an imagination test that goes back with big data sets of people to the 1950s. She wrote this paper called The Creativity Crisis, published in 2010, where her conclusion was that imagination and IQ had risen together till the mid-90s, at which point IQ kept rising and imagination started to fall. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek, and there was a lot of soul searching about what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? What does this mean for Pixar? And I didn't hear anybody in the climate movement say, shit, what does this mean for us? Because fundamentally, Walida Imarisha says, all organizing is science fiction, fundamentally. Like all activism and social change work is about trying to help people imagine something better. And so this thought got under my skin that we are facing a crisis that demands that we reimagine everything with boldness and audacity and brilliance, and that our imagination muscle, which should be kind of finely toned, has become sort of flaccid over this sort of a war on the imagination that we've been through for the last 20-30 years. And so it felt to me like there was something that was collectively just out of our field of vision that no one was looking at, that was sort of desiccating and dwindling and blowing away in the wind. And I wanted to put it right back on the table and say, if we lose this, we're really, really, really in trouble. And to center that and expand that. And, I have a long background around Tibetan Buddhism, and and I would like in the West we always talk about compassion as like helping an old lady across the road or helping a cat out of a tree. It's like a nice to have, bit soft. The Tibetans write about compassion like a flash of lightning. They talk about compassion as being like a diamond, like it's a kind of elemental kind of life force. And I feel the same about imagination, and that's why I center it in the work that I do.
Thank you, Rob. And you you alluded to, I suppose, talked about the research around decline in imagination, and how ironic that as that was produced, the concern was voiced through a total lack of imagination about the structure that we were in at the time around growth. Why? From your experience in your writing and your reading, what do you see as the kind of big forces that are, pressing down on individual and collective imagination? And I want to come on in a moment to ask you a bit more about the difference, if there is a difference between the two. But yeah.
So in the paper, The Creativity Crisis, that Kyung-Hee Kim wrote, she attributed it to three things. She said it was due to the decline of free, unstructured play in the lives of our children, that it was due to the rise of screens in our lives and to the rise of testing in schools. I think there's a few things that I would add to that, which are that we also spend much less time in the natural world. All of our most imaginative people got a lot of their inspiration from spending time in the natural world. But I think maybe most importantly is the link between imagination and cortisol. So the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain where your imagination fires from, remembering the past, imagining the future, all center around the hippocampus. And if you do either of those, it's exactly the same neural pathways that kick in, whichever of those two you're doing, right? The thing about the hippocampus is that it is the part of the human brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are stressed or anxious or experiencing trauma or anxiety, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. Not permanently, that we have neuroplasticity. This is not a permanent state of affairs. But, so if you are experiencing systemic racism, if you're living in Gaza, if you're not figuring out how you're going to pay your rent next week, imagining the future is kind of a nice to have. It's like something that we don't really have the capacity for, right? Not always, but it doesn't help. And so I feel like in many ways we are living in a cortisol economy right now. So many people are living in this kind of precarious state. And so it's why, I write in the book about saying, I think we need to recognize we need to recognize the right to live an imaginative life, and that requires certain conditions to be met. And when we live in a time when imagination, art, and creative writing is being designed out of most people's educational experience. Not if you go to private school. If you go to private school, they have amazing theatre rooms and creative writing because they recognize that's how you produce rounded, successful people. If you're going through the state system, that stuff's pretty much all gone. And now in the university system, they're trying to get rid of the humanities. I met someone the other day who said they were doing English literature at university. I wanted to hug them. I was like, my God, someone's still doing that. This is amazing. So it's like this, there is a kind of the devaluing of imagination starts very early, and we create the conditions to undermine it from very early as well. And so for me, I feel like in our movements, in everything that we do, we need to be creating and holding the space and naming how important this is, and that imagination is something that needs space as individuals, as organizations, as a whole society. If you don't make space for reimagining things, you're just going to continue as they are. And I would just say as well that I think often in our society, we use terms like imagination and creativity and innovation completely interchangeably, and they're really different things. Like creativity and innovation are very much existing to kind of serve capitalism and to turn people's imagining into things that people can make money out of. Imagination is a bit naughty. It's a bit mischievous. It's a bit wayward. You can't really control it, and it demands that you reimagine things. Ursula Le Guin once said something like, the word creativity has become so debased by capitalism that I refuse to use it any longer. But she said, but they can't have imagination. And I kind of feel like that. It's an elemental, mischievous force that it's like the fool in Shakespeare. Like it demands that it asks the questions of what underpins things in a way that creativity just doesn't quite go there.
Yes, and I think certainly like you said, structurally, there's structural impediments to imagination, and I think structurally speaking, creativity is valued in this way of being productive, whereas imagination is sometimes seen as a folly, a waste of time, naivety,
a luxury,
because it's seen as that threat, I think.
Yeah.
Just my last question for this patch, and then I'll hand to Eddie. So I mentioned you talk about collective imagination, and we have, Eddie and I, we have our sort of own essence of why that in particular feels important, the shared sense making and creation in that way. But I just wondered for you, Rob, what's important about collective imagination and how and if it differs from individual imagination.
I mean, I think the collective imagination is the important bit for me, that actually it's the moments when large groups of people come together to reimagine things, that big shifts happen. And I think it's really important to say, I'm not for a moment saying all we need to do is to sit around and reimagine things. Like one of my great heroes is Mariam Kaba, who's a prison abolition activist in the US, and she says we must imagine while we build, always both. And that's it for me. Like, the transition movement always has had this element of you bring people together to imagine things, to fire people up with possibilities. You dream what you're going to do, and then you go do it. And that's like a cycle that you kind of keep coming back to and keep going through. In Totnes at the moment, we have a project called Transition Homes, which came out about 16 years ago of a community visioning thing about housing. We're being failed by private developers. We're being failed by local authority builders. What if we became our own developers? And so we now have a project called Transition Homes, which is building 39 houses in Totnes for people in housing need in the town, which will be always in community ownership as a community land trust. That wouldn't exist if we hadn't have held that space for dreaming and visioning much, much bigger than what was currently on offer. So, when we, but also I would also think it's really important to say that doing large community scale imagining, visioning stuff is a skill that we have to learn. Gil Scott-Heron said the revolution will not be televised. I think if he was writing now, he might say the revolution will be really well facilitated. And we need to be facilitating and training people who can do that kind of imagining work at scale. Don DeLillo, in his book Underworld, he said longing on a large scale is what makes history. And actually, so when we talk about innovation and creativity, if you want to get funding for innovation, people throw billions of dollars at you for innovation. If you say I want to cultivate longing at a scale, that's much harder. But that for me feels right now like by far the more important work to do, and that needs people coming together with their own imaginations in good health, but also with the expertise of how you cultivate longing on a larger and imagination on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so much to say, and I think I will take a little liberty, Matt, pull me in, but I want to kind of contextualize how I'm approaching, and then I want us to dive into that world. There's so many things that you said, and Matt teed it up for us. We have a real deep fascination with meaning, specifically in relationship to imagination, and even into conceptualizing and orienting where we are right now. As an example, for us, we've used this way of talking about what we're trying to do with the process of learning a new language or a second language, mainly because what we need what we're interested in is how do we help people bring what we have to the table to create something that might function completely different than how we understand it to be now. Our clearest example is like our biggest example is when we talk about money. Money is just a facilitator, but not. That's when we talk about the essence of what it is. But in practice, in society, it is a determinant. It determines what we do. For instance, getting funding to do a thing that is not necessarily facilitated by the dollars themselves. It's facilitated by the people who move in response to that facilitator of money. And as we're talking about having people imagine a future and imagine a world, I think part of the challenge is similar to like when you deal with someone who's trying to learn a new language, is you go to imagine, but your native language shows up first. And you have to be in a practice of reaching for a new definition for this stimulus to create a new idea. Another way of saying this is we've had the conversation, we use the example a lot of saying, do we grow food to feed people, or do we grow food for some other purpose? And how we answer that question inform what we design and what we think of? The last little bit I'll put here is a thought about, I mean, you joined the call and I was talking about how the pleasure principle doesn't belong to capitalism. And specifically in the ways that we've inherited the story about how the world works and what society is. There are these things, to your point, around creativity, innovation, that capitalism has kind of claimed for itself. But it's also claimed survival in many ways for a lot of people. It's also claimed thriving for a lot of people, but it doesn't belong to that system. And in fact, I think it sells a counterfeit version of those very things, that we're wanting to connect people with the reality of when we say survival and thriving, those two things can actually be synonymous in terms of how we're thinking about it. And so I put all that context there to say that, when we jump into this conversation, my questions are when you talked about creating these future memories that people pull on in order to even imagine this future. Like if you only consume certain things, or if you're not exposed to the ways people are already changing the world, then it might be a tall order for you to imagine a world that functions differently. And there's a part of me that wonders, there seems to be almost like a narrative journey that people need to take in order to embrace that imagining, right? So like you mentioned, if someone is surviving up to their neck in survival now, imagining the future is almost like a nice to have. And so you kind of have to take that layer off before they can step into the next level of imagining. I'm curious to know, and again, I realize I've said a lot and this is maybe a weighty question, but in your experience of helping people navigate that journey, have you noticed the narratives that kind of lead to the unpacking of other narratives? So like we start here and we detangle ourselves from how money shapes our reality. And then that opens space for more imagination in this way, or food systems or housing or what have you. I'm curious to know. Yeah.
I mean, I think I became really fascinated by the power of asking really good what if questions, thing that can unlock so much. And I mentioned before about Mariam Kaba and the prison abolition movement. What I've always loved about the prison abolition movement is it's such a generative what if question. People go, yeah, but if we had no prisons, you'd have to have such a different education system. Yeah, keep going. Do you know what I mean? It's actually, you ask a what if question and it opens up more and it opens up more. And one of the examples that I use all the time is about a city in Belgium called Liège. where in Liège, they had a very strong transition movement there, like in 2013, 2014. And they came up with a what if question, which was, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Was this what they called a food belt, the Liège food belt? And so they organized an open space day where they invited everybody in Liège who cared about food and was interested, and for whom that question triggered something where they thought, yeah, I've got something to contribute to that, actually. So they organized this big open space event. They thought 100 people would come. 600 people came to this event. And off the back of that and the momentum of that event, they then went on to launch 30 new cooperatives in the city. And they raised 5 million euros of investment in those cooperatives from the people of Liège investing into those co-ops. If you go to Liège now, like 12 years later, they produce 3,500 school meals every day. They have all sorts of producers now, young people who've started food growing businesses around the city. The municipality has invested millions of euros into this. They have a food logistics hub on the edge of the city. It's awesome. It's one of those things where, like, every time I go there, I'm blown away by it. And then I come back and I talk to people who are real, like, experts in this kind of stuff. And I say, my God, have you ever been to Liège? And they go, I'm going to go. And I think, oh shit, they're going to come back and go, well, Rob, it wasn't anywhere as good as you said it was going to be. And they all come back going, oh my God, it was amazing. So, you know, but that wouldn't have happened without that question. So a lot of the work that I do is about working with people to try and get them into a kind of a playful enough, expansive enough sort of a space with other people with a really good overarching what if question. We do this exercise called the walk of what if, where they go off with a big question. And we also, before they do that, we do the exercise from improv, the difference between yes but and yes and. So they go out in a kind of yes and mindset. So I say, during the time of your walk, no one is allowed to say yes but if someone makes a suggestion, you can yes and it. And then they go off and they have a walk. So for me, it's like how we find those things that are generative, that you do with other people, that open up a whole more expansive way of thinking than you might not have been. And you can't just jump straight to that, in my experience. You kind of build up. So that when I do like a day-long workshop with groups with organization, that comes in the afternoon after we've had a morning of playing games and time traveling and drawing and making collages. And you have to build up to being in that kind of state, I think.
Yeah. And it's funny because I'm admittedly a person who I'm jumping off a cliff into the deepest of waters. And for me, I find, but not necessarily in facilitation. Walking people through is a thing that we understand. I think it brings up for me a thing that I'm curious as someone who's been holding this for such a time. One of the things, again, we've brought up money before. Money is one of those big things that we really feel like it could be a really fun thing to reimagine, specifically how it works. And sometimes when we have this conversation, we jump to examples of alternative currencies, local currencies, and I'm not negating any of those efforts. I think there's beauty that comes from there. But I think there's also this very interesting opportunity of thinking about if we could actually hold reimagining the purpose of money itself, like that spending money is a part of ensuring well-being of the planet and the people and all of those things. And specifically in a way that might change how we go to answer the rest of the questions. So like, as an example, we've had there's another example that we've had sometimes when we talk about on when people take a flight, the idea is that first class is offering the best experience. But is it the best experience because you have coach to compare it to? Or is it actually the best experience that we can design? And if it is the best experience we can design, why wouldn't we just make that the standard for the experience across the board? And if we continue to follow that, do we then start to think about actually if flights, by their nature of how the planes are designed, are actually good for the environment? That travel is not about how we can kind of squeeze money out of each other, because money is not the thing that we're prioritizing. It's what it facilitates that we're prioritizing. But that conversation seems really hard to get to a lot of times because we stop short of things that I think are a bit of the demands of the current status quo to explain itself. Like to your point, you're doing an innovation project, you can get money thrown at you. But if you're doing imagination, you haven't necessarily sold it to the status quo well enough for money to move in that direction. However, a big part of this whole movement that we're working towards is to move our efforts in new directions. And so it seems sometimes I feel like I personally get stuck at the conversation of saying, there is a bigger box that we're operating in that is potentially limiting what we imagine and how we imagine both the process of getting there and the potential outcomes of what we can produce. And it's hard to figure out how to get people into that conversation. And I'm thinking for you is that do you think this conversation about the facilitation of money or the purpose of money is a block for our imagination? And what might we be able to do to kind of get around that?
Yeah, great question. I think with my transition movement hat on, I would say that's really that we've always worked on the basis of communities as laboratories for this kind of thing, because to do that on a national scale is huge, right? But actually at a community scale, you can kind of draw a bit of a circle around things and you can do some really innovative stuff. And actually, if it doesn't work, well, it's just another mad idea that came out of a place. But sometimes those ideas can really gain traction and their own momentum and really take off. And you mentioned about local currencies. A lot of transition groups, none of them in the UK, none of them are running anymore. But we had the Totnes pound for 11 years as a local currency thing. And much more importantly than the physical notes it was just trying to get people into thinking differently about their relationship with money. I remember research that said if you go shopping with plastic cards, you can do all of your shopping and have no conversations. If you go shopping with local currency, you have 20, 30 conversations. At a time when we're in an epidemic of loneliness, maybe we should be looking at a local currency as being a community mental health strategy as much as anything else. But so for example, from some of the things that we've been developing here in Totnes in South Devon, which is the first transition town project, we've spent years building a culture where people understand that the really amazing things that we could be doing will only happen if they get involved and support those things to happen. So we've built a culture of people feeling comfortable and excited about the idea of buying shares in new community projects or backing community projects. Recently, there was in Stir to Action magazine, they had like a chart showing the places in the UK which generated the highest amount of community investment, and it was London and then Bristol, which is like whatever Bristol is, 700,000 people or something, and then Totnes, which is about 9,000 people. We were third in the charts because we've spent like 15 years building that culture. We do an event every year called the Local Entrepreneur Forum. We have a whole bunch of people who are retired people who take a bit of money out of their self-invested pension every year to bring along to choose one of the entrepreneurs that year that they want to back. And there's now 40, 50 businesses that exist in this town because we had built that process where people feel comfortable in doing that. But that's a long cultural process.
Yeah.
And the local currency played a role in that. We did a thing called the Local Economic Blueprint, which is an analysis of the economy in the town, where we looked at, well, where does all the money go? Where does all the money go? How much of the money that is spent into the town goes into chain businesses? How much goes into local independent businesses? So we could make an economic case for why that works. Then we had several really high profile things that got community-led investment. Now you look at a town like Frome in Somerset, they've just raised nearly £1 million to buy a site in the middle of town for the community to become the developer of that site. And this sort of shifting people's imagining of money to being something that you need to hoard and protect, to being something that you need to find and feel confident in creative ways of investing it to bring this new world about, is something that takes time and focus to do. But it's just one kind of example of that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, and this, this will be my last question for now, is I mean, you bring up something that for me is a big part of, I know, our work and what we're seeing, which is, um, I mean, society is a performance. It's a daily activity that we are all creating on a regular basis. And I know in my own local organizing here, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that the we're conditioned to imagine that the government are the people who are in office, not all the citizens of that particular area who are participating as the government. We are the ones running the grocery store. We are the ones running the transportation. We run all the facets that we give some people power over the decisions and policies, but we are the arms, hands, feet of all of our systems. And there is a bit of this transition that requires that people see themselves as facilitators of systems, not just the system happening over there with those people who are doing the system things.
Absolutely.
And I think that some of the challenge with that, like kind of to your point, is making that embrace something that also feels good versus overwhelming. Because again, there's a huge narrative that suggests go to work, put your head down, get your check, survive. And then but when you have opportunities and local ways to practice new ways, it builds a capacity for more ownership of the ability to shape the reality that you live within. And for us, we're thinking people having access to those local ways of practicing is, I think, a big determining factor of the success of the local organizing efforts in general. And I think I'm curious to know and it's less of, I'll have less of a question here and more of a thought about, for people who might be holding that tension of what is my entry point into practicing this future now? Because, and I guess, and again, this is just me, so I'm just kind of my brain is going crazy right now. But I think the place I'm asking this question from is that there's also a bit of a notion that we're going to do this work and then we're going to return to normal, versus this work is the new normal. This kind of consistent care for the community, this curiosity about what else can we change, this practice of asking what if and composting what was will be essentially a feature of the new reality. It won't necessarily have a welcome party and an announcement, right? How do we invite people into that orientation with this work versus put your head down for a little while and soon enough you'll get to kind of check back out and the government will be somebody else's problem?
I think so. I mentioned Richard Heimberg at the beginning of this conversation, and I remember when he wrote the foreword for the Transition Handbook, he said that this is a movement that feels more like a party than a protest march. And that's the kind of spirit, I think. And, when you were saying about people, last week I was up in the northeast of England doing a 5-date training tour with Joseph Rantry Foundation, taking the How to Fall in Love with the Future training that I do to places this stuff often doesn't go to, like Middlesbrough and Hartlepool and places like this. And one of those places, we were in Durham, and we were in a place called the Pitman's Parliament. The Pitman's Parliament in the 1800s was the second most powerful seat of democracy in the UK. It was all of the coal mines across the north of England sent a delegate to the Pitman's Parliament. And it's this big space. It's like a Methodist church. And they made decisions. They were extremely powerful. And the fact that we have Saturdays, the fact that we have weekends, the fact that we have paid holidays, all came about from those people, not from the people down in London. It's not like they were like out of the beneficence of their heart. Those people, they fought for something. And it's like, in terms of the question about people being involved, I feel one of the things that I've learned from being around the transition movement, as somebody who has a long background in permaculture and being a permaculture teacher, is that you design something like transition, that you design community-led groups, the ones that are really successful are the ones that have lots of edge, what we would call edge, like lots of surface area. So it's not like a Friends of the Earth campaign. This month, our campaign in Friends of the Earth is getting rid of plastic bags. So tell everybody to use less plastic bags. In transition, you design a group. So you have a food group, and you have an energy group, and a housing group, and a making things group, and an education group. And each of those groups, the food group might be doing planting trees, planting nut-bearing trees in community spaces. It might be running a community garden. It might be going into schools and helping them to grow food. And it might be looking at setting up a regional food hub to do food in different ways, for example. So if you've just got like an hour a week, but you love planting trees, you can go along and help them plant trees. If you've got a day a week, you could volunteer, you could get involved in that. So there are as many different ways in as possible. You know, we have to recognize that people, and also that I think we have to, from the beginning, try to make sure that we are designing the projects that we're designing in those groups so that they don't depend on the idea that this project will always be driven by volunteers, that actually we bring a kind of more of an entrepreneurial mindset to these things. I remember that the only time I've ever been in the US in 2013, I was on an event with a woman called Daria Robinson from Richmond, California. Runs an amazing project called Urban Tilth. Phenomenal, working with young people in Richmond, teaching them how to grow food with 5 different community farmers. They do vegetable box schemes every week. Amazing woman. And I said something like, you know, well, we have to recognize that that if we always imagine that all of our projects are just going to be driven by volunteers all the time, we're going to end up with exclusively middle-class white movements. And she said, it's so good to hear you say that, because if this is a revolution that depends on volunteers, I can't be part of that. And no one in Richmond can be part of it, because people are working 4 jobs just to keep the, you know, so we have to bring this sort of way of thinking. So for example, in my town, we started a community-owned brewery. It ran for 11 years. Sadly, it was killed off by the energy price rises after the Ukraine war started. But it ran for 11 years. We employed like 10 or 11 people who could pay their mortgages and feed their kids. And it's like, we could have just done like a nice community voluntary brewing experiment thing.
Yeah.
But actually bringing that mindset to things of saying, not only do we need to reimagine what the local economy of this place is going to be, we need to be the people who then step up and actively make that happen, like with transition homes, you know. So if we can bring those two kind of mindsets together, I think we can unlock some dynamite stuff.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. The question I'm coming in with here is, simply put, is perhaps about the circle that you said you could draw in a community where there's an experiment going on that perhaps can shine an example. And I suppose the question, again, simply put, is how do we expand those circles? If that is, maybe not expand the circles, but what happens when the circles start to interact? And I'll just preface this by saying, with Commonplace, what we're hosting in our monthly workshops, we'll have people from across the world coming together and exploring a particular theme or topic. And thinking about imagination, what that brings, of course, is that picture that you gain of global society becomes all the richer, but there are also the challenges of creating the engagement when it's not something that feels sometimes doesn't feel super local and tangible and within reach. And I just wondered, from your perspective, how does that bridging happen? Because we're talking about systems like climate, like economies that do cross borders, and in doing so create a whole other set of influences on other systems. So from the communities that you've worked with, as they start to reach out and connect with other communities, are you seeing how that is then enabling them to think differently about systems? And what might you say to us, as we're starting from a slightly different perspective, where we don't necessarily have place-based projects, but we have people coming together, as I say, from many different countries?
I think for me that always just comes back to stories. You know, like my role in the transition movement for 15 years really was scanning that movement for stories and then finding the interesting ways to share them in blogs, in films, in podcasts, in whatever, comic books, whatever it was that we came up with to share those stories. It's like the stories are the things, like, you know, when with the transition movement, we always said when people wanted to become transition town and get involved in transition, we always said, you know, it's free. There's no like annual membership to be a transition town. If you decide you're a transition town, you're a transition town. But the only commitment is you share your stories back into that network. And it's the stories that spread. It's the stories that stick, because the stories, then people can see themselves in it. And so the beauty when you build a network like we did in the transition movement is that one place can come up with a story and everywhere else goes, yeah, that's cool, we could do that. You know, so we started a thing in Totnes called Transition Streets. The idea of Transition Streets was that like how do you help people to reduce their energy use, their water use, their shopping habits, that sort of stuff. Really difficult. What do? Do you send them a information pack in the post? Like, how do you do it? And so we designed this thing that was, you form groups on your street of 6 to 10 neighbors. We give you a workbook. We facilitate your first meeting. And then you meet 7 times and you look at water one week, energy the next week. And because you all live in the same sort of houses and you all live in the same part of town, you can come up with solutions that are very easy then for you all to take up and things to do together. We did the first time we did it in a town of 9,000 people, 550 households took part. And on average, they cut their carbon footprint by about 1.3 tons. They saved themselves about £500-600 a year. What was fascinating was afterwards, when they were asked what benefits they felt from it, no one mentioned the money or the carbon. They just said, well, I know my neighbors better. I feel part of my community. I feel more connected. You know, that model of Transition Streets took off. There's an Australian version, a Belgian version. It was adapted for different towns and neighborhoods across the UK. You know, there's many things like that, where if you can, like in France, there's a little town called Ungersheim, tiny little place, 2,500 people, has this visionary mayor who in 2014 showed his team a film called In Transition 2.0, a film about the transition movement, which listeners can find on YouTube. And at the end of it, he said to his team, let's do that, all of that. And they created this plan to do, like, they called them 21 projects for 2021. Really ambitious, phenomenal. There was a film that was made a few years ago called Qu'est-ce qu'on attend, which means what are we waiting for? That tells the story about Ungersheim. It's been shown all over France and inspired people all over France. So for me, it's the stories and the people, so people can hear those stories and go, yeah, I'm kind of like that. If they can do that, surely I can do that. You know, it's like people who saw the very first Sex Pistols shows when they played, who came out thinking, well, if they can do that, what can I do? That's like the thing for me. Like, how do we make this stuff? You know, I always remember there was one of my favorite things from the early days of punk, which was a big kind of influence on me, was this thing that showed you how to play 3 chords on a guitar. And it said, here are 3 chords, now form a band. And I love that kind of spirit. It's like, here's a story. That could be you. It's actually not that hard to do it. Look, here's what they did. Here's the first few things they did. It's really not that hard. So that's the thing for me. It's like how we support people to become the storytellers who can talk about the stories that they're doing. Because, you know, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there, does it make a sound? If a town in the Northeast does an amazing project and no one ever hears about it, it's like achieving 1% of what it possibly could. So we need to get, I think for me, the kind of network you're talking about needs to train people up to be the best storytellers in terms of telling the stories about what they're doing.
And I think bringing, as you say, bringing that inspiration of what they need, and us being able to facilitate them and us and others creating those templates, or those, not so much templates, but those bits that start people off. My final question, Rob, is appreciating that the work that you do is very emergent, and that you, I sense probably, you know, there's not a kind of, we will do X and then Y and Z will definitely be achieved. If, taking all that into consideration, if you had one wish at the moment for the work that you're doing, where it might go next, what would that be?
Well, I can give you a very specific example, which is that we're developing this touring, immersive music theater and light projection thing called Field Recordings from the Future, which is based on a music project that I started doing with a guy called Mr. Kit, who's an amazing ambient electronic music artist. And the idea is that it's like we pick the audience up in 2026 and we take them to the 2036 that was the result of us doing everything we could have possibly done. And it's a kind of an emotional journey, and we take them to visit incredible cycling infrastructure, regenerative agriculture, landscapes rewilded by beavers, economies that are becoming much, much more equal. And we're going to be doing a 5-date tour of it in the UK, starting in Sheffield in November, going to London and Bristol and a couple of other places. We're really, really ambitious about it, and we want it to be like the kind of Cirque du Soleil of the climate movement, where it's being performed in 10, 20 places at the same time, and people are just opening time portals in different places all around the world. And because I feel like there's that lovely thing that Rilke said about the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And actually, this is our way to try and use those tools that we have to do that. And we've written it in such a way that, a bit like The Office, they can be a US version that's maybe not quite as good as the UK one, but it's still like adapts to that place. So there could be an American version where there's someone else who's playing the character of me. And so the first show is going to be in November, in 11th, 12th, 13th in Sheffield. If anyone's listening to it, come along and see it. And we're really we're coming back to what we said at the beginning about longing on a large scale is what makes history. For me, with that, as somebody who's been the climate activist for a long time, comes a realization that climate activists are rubbish at cultivating longing. It's not what we do. It's not in our makeup. It's not in our psyche. And actually, we can't do this without artists and people who can make amazing music and project things onto the side of buildings and write stories that break people's hearts and give them goosebumps. And that's where this is kind of going for me.
Amazing.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we can share a link to that as well if you've got links to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would just say on that, I do a newsletter every month now, because it's the only way that you can really reliably cheat algorithms shunting you into a siding. And so I do a newsletter every month called the Time Travelers Gazette. And if people want to go to robhopkins.net, there's a box at the top that says email newsletter. If you pop your email address in there, you'll hear when all these shows are coming up, when tickets are available, and all the developments with that. It's the best way. This isn't a journey that ended when How to Fall in Love with the Future came out. That's just a snapshot of where I was at that time. This is very much an ongoing, evolving journey. And if you want to follow me on that, that's the best way.
Yeah, Eddie.
Yeah, it's weird. Do we put a question after that? That felt like a period. I will say this, just because when you talk about longing, a thing that just me personally, I've just been wary of in our stories about the future and longing, is that I've heard a lot of stories that also kind of put things. There's a lot that gets washed away about modernity in this vision of the future that I feel it's important to keep, not necessarily because we need it, but like fashion needs to be a part of this conversation. Not just that we're gonna, and I say that because to me, that is the residue of the current status quo that determines how we get to organize ourselves and what we get to prioritize and what we get to revolutionize as a point of doing this. And for me, as we're talking about wanting to create a society that people long for, I think what comes to me is reclaiming, we had a recent conversation, Matt and I, talking about I think it was, I don't know, it was the Met. It was something like one of those celebrity events. And I was watching comments online where people were like, I can't believe folks are giving this any attention and energy. And then I was thinking at the same time, wanting to see people dressed and adorned beautifully feels like nature itself. Like landscapes are gorgeous. Flowers are absolutely gorgeous. They're like, nature itself loves beauty. And so it feels odd to criticize in us that desire to see people draped and dressed in ways that we love. We can create a fashion industry that is just as much artistic and expressive, and good for the environment and all these other things, that is actually beyond the scope of what we've imagined to date. We can have a restaurant industry that is just as robust in terms of people going out and dining together. That doesn't necessarily mean we deplete the Earth's resources to fuel and arrange it. We can do things that right now might be co-opted by capitalism in ways that we define as frivolous, like going to the movies or watching TV or using social media, like all of these different things that we're confining to the container that they operate in now, but in the longing of a future where our capacity is unleashed beyond what capitalism gives us permission to access. There's a world where, we're not thriving looks like pushing, achieving what I think we've tried to use growth to achieve. And growth was never going to do it. But our capacity to reimagine how we organize ourselves and the purpose for which we even do society to begin with can create images where people don't just imagine us in monochrome spacesuits going in and out of homes that look exactly, that strip the character that we currently enjoy out of our lives. I'll wrap, and I'm just offering these thoughts, but it makes me think of I forget who it was, but someone made a observation where they said, we might desire climate controlled spaces, but that doesn't mean we desire air conditioning. Or we want preserved food, that doesn't mean that the answer is refrigerators. And so how can we take even the possibility of the comforts and the delights and the seemingly, again, like I said, frivolous desires that are a part of modernity and put those things in the future as a part of creating that story of longing that isn't just about the big picture, major regenerative farms, but that is something that coincides with nights out with your friends in the future that isn't, you get what I mean? And so I just wanted to offer that as a way of talking.
That's really, really beautifully put, Eddie. And I feel like, if this future isn't way more beautiful than the current one, then I'm fighting for the wrong thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like, actually, of course. And when it comes to fashion, the reality is that what we mean by fashion right now means that we make 100 billion garments a year in the world. Yes. About 30 billion of those don't get sold and just get pulped, and of the rest that get bought, 60% of them are thrown away after a year. I think actually if we stop making any new clothes at all, we have enough clothes to last us for decades. And so for me, it's like, actually, in this future, like my kids generation, they never buy new clothes. All their clothes are kind of pre-loved vintage. Once we stop calling them secondhand and call them vintage and pre-loved clothes, it's like huge. Like Vinted is now one of the biggest kind of platforms going. So I think it's like we can actually have cooler people wearing the most amazing clothes that we could, because we're rehashing, we're remixing, like hip hop culture built out of sampling everything that came before, and it's the most phenomenal genre of music. We'll see the same with clothes when people are kind of mixing up a bit of this and a bit of that. Way cooler than just buying things off the shelf. And the same, when it comes to food. It's like, actually, when you are, I remember with that time, the only time I've ever been to the US, and I remember coming from the UK where every pub you went into had like 3 beers. They'd have a best and a bitter and a stout, and they might have a lager. And I went to Boston and I went to this bar where they had 80 different beers on from local breweries. It was the first time I saw that kind of craft beer movement, which is sadly now sort of rather depleted from what it was then. It blew me away. And it was like so many really innovative local places doing amazing different things. If you go to Italy on holiday, you go to one village, they'll say, oh, you must try our olive oil. It's the best olive oil in the world. Or the next town, you go there, their olive oil, it's just fa schifo. It's just, you wouldn't wash your car with that stuff. And then you go to that town and they're like, our olive oil is the best. We kind of lost that kind of that sense of what the French call terroir, like that sense of place, and that you can, like, now you go to Wagamama's in New York, you go to Wagamama's in Hull, it tastes exactly the same. It should be that every place that we go to Hull, because there are flavors you only get there because of things that are made there and how they do things there. And, you know, for me, the future, any future worth fighting for, is going to be infinitely more delicious, and people are going to be so much more gorgeous and have so much more exciting nights out, which actually end with them going to a particular place in town where at 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's where you hear the nightingales singing in that part of town, and you know, that's how they end their evening off. And so it's like we have to the reality is that if we don't do anything, right, we can see what's happening right now all across Europe, around the world. Business as usual is taking us off a cliff faster than anybody thought it was going to be. So the only alternative to that is to fundamentally reimagine how we do so many things. And if our stories are just like, it's going to be a bit rubbish, really, and the food's going to be boring, and everyone's going to be looking really, really rubbish clothes, it's like, no. That, again, to come back to, for me, the inspiration for me in the work I do comes from those amazing, vibrant futurist movements around the world: indigenous futurism, queer futurism, Afrofuturism, which does the most beautiful job of filling the future with these bright, vibrant, colorful clothes and the most amazing music and the best food and the incredible architecture. That's what needs to underpin all this. Like, it's not just about, when I say about telling the best stories, it's like telling the sexiest stories, the most delicious stories, the nights out people go on in 2036. Oh my God, you wait, the just the music and the color, and you know, that's the bit I think is often, like, for me, I just got bored. I got so bored of reading books by middle-aged white men about collapse, and they may well be right. I'm not dissing that as a thing. They may well be right, and if we keep going in the trajectory that's absolutely where we're headed. But at the same time, I get so much inspiration mostly from women of color in the US: Adrienne Marie Brown, Walida Emerisha, Ruha Benjamin, Mariam Kaba. Mariam Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us, is one of the great works of the radical imagination, just phenomenal. And they look at the future, and like in Rashida Phillips' Black Quantum Futurism, we bow down at their feet, like, phenomenal. Like the work that they do around time travel and playing with time and color, and this whole kind of aesthetic is just so beautiful. So for me, it's like, this has to be the most enticing invitation around, has to be full of color and love and beauty, and that's then a future worth fighting for.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.